I'm David Canning. I'm the Associate Director of the Pop Center. I think we've had a wonderful morning of talks. And what we'd like to turn to now is to have three of the current faculty associated with the Pop Center talk about their work. My own feeling is one of the great things about the Pop Center is its focus on really important questions. Most departments in the university are focused on methodologies. And what really, I think, distinguishes the Pop Center is its interdisciplinary nature, bringing people from different methodologies together to tackle what are really big questions in the world. And so what I'd like to do is to give each of our panelists the opportunity to speak just for a few minutes and to really identify the big question that motivates our own work. And what I'm hoping is that we then have plenty of time after our panelists to have our very distinguished audience have the opportunity to ask questions and to state their views about what the important topics that we should be addressing are. So I would like to start by inviting Amitabh Chandra, who's a professor of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government, to talk. Amitabh, I think, will be well known to many people for his work on access to healthcare and inequalities in healthcare. But I'd invite him now to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm thrilled to be here, and I just wanted to share a personal story about my connection to the Pop Center. I came to Harvard as a new faculty member in 2005, and Lisa Berkman was one. I didn't know who Lisa was, but she invited me to the Pop Center and connected me to people all over campus. And so I see many of you in the room, and it has really been an exciting 9 years for me to work with people at the School of Public Health, to work with people at the medical school, to work with people at the law school and the ed school. And none of this would have been possible had it not been for the glue that the Population Center provides at Harvard. And I think for an institution like Harvard, organizations like this are especially important because of the peculiar geography of our campus, where half the campus is 5 miles away from the other half. So thank you for this opportunity. What I work on is American healthcare, and in particular, I work most recently on the challenge of paying for new medical technologies. What I want to talk about today is how that challenge applies to developing countries. When I think about the challenge that a country like India or China or Bangladesh faces, one often thinks about, well, what about poverty? What about development? And these are absolutely important. What I focus on is the challenge of how will they struggle to cover the kinds of innovations that we read about every day in the newspaper. They're under tremendous pressure to expand health insurance because health insurance is valuable to their citizens. What invariably happens with that focus on health insurance is that we tend to confuse health insurance with healthcare with health, and those three words get used interchangeably. They've been used interchangeably in so much of the work that I read, that it is a little disappointing, because going back to Michael's comments, simply insuring the population does not necessarily mean that you have given them access to the kinds of inputs that they need to live a healthy life. And again, I'm not arguing that health insurance is not valuable. I've argued again and again that we should universally cover everyone in the United States. But India is not the United States, and China is not the United States. And my great worry is that as they start to think that health insurance is the same as giving people health, they get really distracted from the things that really, really matter. And I'm thinking here about the big, grand public health campaigns that they have dropped the ball on. And I'm thinking here about education, which I think has a transformative effect on people's lives. At the end of the day, it's a challenge that I think is compounded by growing inequality, both in the United States and in a country like India, for a very simple reason. Rich Indians are like middle-class Americans. And so rich Indians are at a point in the income distribution where they benefit most not from another polio vaccine, but from health insurance, from the latest treatment for acute myocardial infarct, or perhaps the latest treatment for stage 4 pancreatic cancer. But as a country starts to cover those expensive treatments for the middle class or the people above the middle class, it becomes very, very hard to say no to other people. And so you'll end up expanding these treatments to everybody. These treatments are valuable, but again, my point is they're not nearly as valuable as a lot of the other things that we used to do for people, but we no longer have the money to do for people. So my message and what I work on is trying to think a lot harder about how we take the lessons from the United States. Many of these are negative lessons, but we can learn a lot from negative lessons. And how do we how do we build institutions in other countries, in countries like Mexico, in South America, in places like Singapore, so that we are able to preserve the benefits of an insurance expansion without getting into the distraction that we struggle with here in the US, where we're basically a big, gigantic insurance company with very little money to do the kinds of things that Michael is talking about. The money is definitely there, but when I say very little money, I mean we have an unwillingness to raise taxes to actually tap into that money. So those are kind of my big thoughts on, as I look ahead 20, 30 years in the United States and around the world, what is the single biggest challenge? I think the single biggest challenge is figuring out how to pay for new medical technology.
Thank you, Amitabh. I'd now like to welcome Subbu Subramanian, who is a professor of Population Health and Geography in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard School of Public Health. And Subbu, I think, will be well known to many people here for his work on the intergenerational transmission of health and health over the life course. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Hope can you hear me? Yeah, okay. And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank the POP Center, Lisa and David. I came to the POP Center as a Bell Fellow. So any Bell Fellows there? I don't know whether I'm at a better place or not, but I think certainly I've had a great time when I came in '99 and have stayed and just have been privileged to have this wonderful opportunity to engage in things that I really care about. What I'm going to sort of just spend like 3-4 minutes is one of the area that I focus on is around child health and development, and specifically the focus has been around undernutrition. And I've been hearing in today's session too, like I think within demography we sort of view things as in terms of population quantity. And I think as we again look towards like low middle income countries, especially around India, where a big focus of mine is, I think we need to look at the population quality. For example, I think in the mortality, we have kind of done reasonably well even on MDGs on the mortality agenda or the survival agenda, but we've been terrible with the growth agenda. So whether it's physical growth of the children or cognitive growth, the data is really stark. So I'll just take sort of one example of a recent study that we did, and then sort of post a new study that we are trying to do and why that study, how we are thinking about it. So the one recent study is like we looked at both in India and across like 37 low middle income countries, the impact of economic growth on child undernutrition. You can either see that child undernutrition for its own sake or as a marker of child's health. And the finding was really striking. A change in economic growth, which has been dramatic in several of these countries, has not translated to any reductions, zero practically for India. And for some of the low middle income countries, it was in the ballpark of 0.04% for a standard deviation change in GDP. And obviously one implication of that, as Lancet series has done, you can think about a lot of direct health investments, right? You need to go directly into different interventions, and there is a list of it you could do if it's nutrition, it's food, or infection, treatment, prevention. But the more sort of we started sort of thinking about this, I was thinking like probably the kind of interventions we need in these countries is not one thing at a time, and it again builds on what Michael was talking about. So what might be the interventions that have multiple spillovers? So this is the sort of the next 3 or 5 years thing that I'm excited about, along with postdocs with whom I'm working. And the one thing that sort of appealed to us through a lot of connection, through a Takemi connection, actually, was the impact that energy, or more specifically solar lights, would have on people's lives. And when I'm talking about people's lives, three aspects of people's lives: health, livelihood, and environment, quality of the environment in terms of air pollution and so on. And I don't know how many of you are familiar, about 1.5 billion people in the world are off-grid. They don't have access to any clean electricity as we experience. In India, this problem is really very widespread. And I don't see any on-grid electricity coming in the next 5 to 10 or 15 years. Despite the last 10 years of economic growth, we've again not seen that come by. So here's a technological intervention that can have a multiple spillovers, potentially positive. And there's been a lot of effort recently. The Bloomberg Foundation just rolled out a huge investment in terms of, I think, some form of a microfinance-based buying solar lights. But it's never been evaluated. So one thing sort of which would be really interesting, and certainly has not been evaluated from a multiple domain aspect. So what are the cost and benefit across all these multiple domains? Often we do one thing at a time. So that's sort of the sort of the one page where I see, as we look at low middle income countries, probably we need to sort of think about these things that have multiple spillovers. So that's a sort of a one way in which we are trying to sort of grapple with this issue of, or do you do one thing at a time? So I'll stop there. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Subbu. And finally, I'd like to invite Mary Waters, who is the M.E. Zuckerman Professor of Sociology in the Department of Sociology, to talk. Mary has worked for many years as an expert in the fields of migration and the effects of natural disasters. And most recently, I think, the focus of her work has been on the effects of Hurricane Katrina. Mary.
Thank you, David. I guess I should start by signaling my age, but I first came to the Pop Center in 1986 when, as a new assistant professor with my degree in sociology and demography from Berkeley, I showed up at the doorstep of the Pop Center and said, "Hello, I'm here, I'm a demographer," and very kindly they took me in, and I worked with many people at the Pop Center over the years and have grown more involved as my work has taken on more of a health emphasis in the last few years, and have very much profited from the interdisciplinary nature of the Pop Center, and congratulate us on our 50 years. As David said, I have worked mostly on immigration and immigrant integration in the United States, especially the children of immigrants, and how we can best integrate them into American society. And in 2005, I was a part of an advisory committee to a study that was being done in various parts of the country, one of which was in New Orleans. And they had collected a year and a half's worth of data on poor black women who were mothers in New Orleans, and they had to stop the year and a half follow-up because the Hurricane Katrina came. And the original people who were doing the study said, "Oh, our study is ruined because we can't keep looking at these people because the hurricane interrupted it." And I said, "Well, I think there's probably some important things going on in New Orleans, and it's really important to have data before a disaster to be able to understand the impact of a disaster." And so I've become a person who studies disasters now, and have been studying these women since 2005. And what I've learned are a couple of things. One is that almost no studies of disasters have pre-disaster data on the people. Secondly, there's a focus in disaster research on the short-term response, which is important. Of course, you have to save people's lives and get in with food and water, et cetera. But very, very few studies follow people longitudinally. And third, there's also a focus on the recovery of place as opposed to people. And with climate change and forced migration from the disasters, which are increasing in frequency and intensity, more and more people are being displaced by weather-related disasters and other disasters. And as we know, with the theme of today, disasters may come randomly, but their effects are very much stronger on the poor because they live in areas that are low-lying. They are more subject to some of the effects of the disasters, and they don't have the resources to bounce back. So you'll probably hear that New Orleans actually is doing quite well, that it has the lowest poverty rate that it's had since 1979. In fact, that's because many of the people, like the women that we're studying, cannot afford to return to New Orleans. Rents have tripled. The city has recovered in many ways, but that is very different from the people who were in the city. So the people that we have been studying are in 31 different states. They very much are feeling isolated, that they don't have the social networks, the social support that they had before the hurricane, and about 1/3 of them are still suffering symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. We've published papers on increases in asthma, headaches, migraines, and increases in BMI, all kinds of physical and mental health long-term impacts from disaster. So what we're working together, and this is a very interdisciplinary group who are working on this, including Subu, and we're working to really try to understand what we can learn from following people over time to try to mitigate some of the effects, both in terms of the original policy responses to disasters, but also in terms of planning for disasters in the future, and in terms of taking what we know about migration and what it takes to integrate people into new communities. If they cannot return, what do we know about the resilience of communities? Some of the things that were talked about this morning, that people are social beings and that being interconnected is very important. And so taking an individualistic approach of how we just let the market forces determine where people end up settling afterwards is really not very good for their health. So this is what we are working on in this project, and we very much are thinking that this is something that will just increase in importance. People are migrating for many different reasons, but one of the things that we are all facing is the impact of climate change, and one of its impacts is going to be increased migration around the world.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to make some brief comments on what's been said. I think in what Amitabh said about universal health care and health, I think is really important. I'm actually quite worried that there will be a move in the successors to the Millennium Development Goals away from health as the outcome towards universal coverage as the goal. And I'm actually very pleased in the current Millennium Development Goals that almost all the goals are welfare goals. They're poverty, they're child mortality, and I think of universal health care, universal access to health care as a mechanism. And the great thing about having goals that are welfare goals is you have to prove your mechanism works to achieve those goals. And I worry that the next set of goals will be more about mechanisms, and then we won't have the emphasis on creating an evidence base. I think access to healthcare does affect health. It also reduces poverty through out-of-pocket expenses. But I think those are arguments that have to be made. So I worry about this movement towards making mechanisms the goal rather than having real welfare goals. In what Subu said about the intergenerational and the transmission of health, I think there's a really important move in demography from just counting deaths and births to looking at in a sense, the quality of people. So what we've been very successful at in developing countries is reducing infant mortality. And I think that's been one of the great successes in public health. But we still have this problem of lack of nutrition and ill health and stunting among children. And I think this has very long-term consequences for both health and worker productivity. So these long-term effects of in utero and early childhood exposures. And I think this movement focused towards the health of children rather than just the mortality is a very important change in the way we think about things. And finally, on what Mary was saying, actually, Jack Rowe was talking about myths. I actually thought when I first saw this data that the number of disasters around the world was increasing, that must be a myth. It's just that we're getting better at noticing disasters and we have more news about disasters. But in fact, I've been convinced by the evidence that actually is happening. And I think there are good reasons for that to do with urbanization and climate change. But the number of disasters is really increasing and it's becoming an increasingly important topic. I think the issue of immigration is a big issue. And while I agree with Jack Rowe and was very impressed with his talk, I think the fundamental point that he made that when there's a conflict which comes about because of aging between human welfare and institutions, it's the institutions that have to change, not the humans. And our institutions aren't set up for aging, and we have to change them. I was a bit worried about one thing he said about, he dismissed immigration as a mechanism because he says that's simply not going to happen. But I actually think that's an institutional constraint that we have. And I think we should be more open to that as a possible mechanism. So I think all the institutions have to be on the table for change. And we shouldn't limit our thinking to say some things are just impossible to do. But I think the fundamental point is changing the institutions in the face of changing circumstances, rather than saying we have to reduce welfare to keep our institutions intact is a fundamentally correct one. And
David, let me respond to that. Almost all my colleagues with European accents, in one form or another, criticize this immigration comment that I made. Because of what happened in Western Europe. And so that, if you're driving a fancy German automobile that was made in a factory in Germany by Turkish workers, and all the signs are in Turkish, and they're all Turkish immigrants, and they made your BMW or more like your Mercedes. There have been, particularly in Algerians in France, there have been experiences in Western Europe where there have been dramatic effects with respect to immigration. So I take your point. I would also point out, though, that immigration in the United States is very, very, very low. It is like 1/3 of 1% a year. And it's much lower than in a lot of those other countries. So that to get to the immigration level that we would need, the proportional increase that we would have to see would be rather dramatic. But nonetheless, it's potentially an institutional change, so I'll accept that. Thank you.
thank you. And I'd like to thank our speakers. And one of the reasons I would really like to thank them is for being so brief and sticking to the timetable, which will now allow us, I hope, plenty of time for the audience to ask questions. And both of our panel speakers and of our earlier plenary speakers, and make any points they would like to make themselves. So please, I'll open it up now to the floor.
Let me share your concern about the new development agenda, the fact that the way it's been constructed might not be pro-poor. But I think that it's too early to come to that conclusion. The one thing that I can assure you is that just about every constituency in this, particularly the G77, insists that the MDGs must fold, unfinished business of the MDGs must fold into the new development agenda. So I think there will be a poverty hook, strong poverty hook. Poverty, now, it's now not going to be cut poverty by half, it's actually eradicate poverty totally. And I think that will be that.
Just briefly to connect both this last comment, but also some things here Michael said about proportional universalism and Amitabh's comment. Another commission which just published, which talks of this grand convergence, the Commission on Investing in Health, borrows actually from the work of Davidson Watkin the concept of progressive universalism, which in turn comes from a WHO report of 1999, the first World Health Report under Gro Brundtland, which spoke of a new universalism. But the whole question is whether you adopt strictly universalist policies, which are indeed not focused per se. I mean, the danger with poverty-oriented policies is that then they segregate, and your famous countryman Titmuss said, services for the poor tend up being poor services. So in order to avoid that segregation, we've tried to modify universalism and add those adjectives. And I like the term progressive universalism, but the question, here's where I link that with Amitabh's comment, it's not just how much people put in and how much they take out, which is your comment. You contribute according to your capacity to pay if the tax system is appropriate, but then you draw according to your need. But it's open. The system is open. It's not doesn't segregate poor people from non-poor. The other question is what gets covered. And I think you need progressivity also in what gets covered, so that not everything is covered for everyone, but only those parts of the health system, those technologies or interventions that have demonstrated greatest welfare gains. And that's the other side of modifying universalism. Mm-hmm. It's that what gets covered is that those elements of all the things that a health system can provide that actually produce the highest gains. And especially for developing countries, actually, ironically, the most cost-effective interventions are those that disproportionately benefit poor people, like immunizations, like good reproductive health services. And so you can actually be efficient, universalist, and pro-poor without having to separate. That's where I hope the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, will take us. I completely agree that to talk of universal coverage, which is a means to an end, is not enough. I distinguish universal enrollment, that's the insurance part, universal coverage, that's when you insure but also provide access, with universal effective coverage. And effective means you get the results you need, which can be universal but also pro-poor, and we get out of that false dilemma in the policy debate.
Thank you. That was very, very valuable.
Hi, Nancy Krieger. I was just reflecting, there were so many different themes that were brought up from all different speakers, so it's a lot to absorb for the day. But I think that what stands out most of all to me is what can be changed, and what's seen as a given versus what can be changed and what would be changed by whom, and where political structures and political conflict fix into that picture, which was not as addressed always as front center in the different presentations, but I think is a key part of it. Because we look at the slides that were shown and what you were saying as well in terms of the wealth inequities, in terms of what the trends are in that, in terms of the question of the governance issues, Julio, that you were raising as well, and who's accountable and who's not. And I would be curious as to people's thoughts as to how, because many times we that are doing the work are in response to what is and how do we mitigate it as opposed to how do we change it. And I think that the changing of the systems that we have vis-a-vis what makes for health equity is really a huge part of the discussion and needs to be central in all of our work. And to think, and the technocratic knowledge that we have is very important, but it's not the answer by itself. And what does it mean to really have people, and that comes out what you were saying with the healthy cities and other things, of actually people becoming more participatory about what the demands and goals are for better health, and for understanding what the obstacles are and for what that means. And I think that there are things that do get done within nations, even as one can speak to the fact that there are global systems, as you were saying. It's also true that we have fights within the United States right now and in many other countries that are exactly on issues that countries do have governance over. And so I think keeping these kinds of questions in mind always of what can change and what can't, and having the long-term view and understanding the pace and rate of change is absolutely critical, but also understanding that the change is, and this speaks, I think, very glad to hear about your way of taking on much more of you have now with regard to the fundamentals of dignity that are being brought up with regard to a human rights perspective, is that on the gender issues, for example, it's about transformations in men, not just what has to happen with women and girls. As if you're talking about sex, you're talking also about sexuality, you're talking about changes between people. How do we bring that out consciously in the work and deal with the power dimension? So I'm not suggesting any answers here, but I'm just saying that if we don't talk about the fact of what the conflicts are, because if this was all easy to resolve, it would have been resolved a long time ago. There really are conflicts, and the concentrations of wealth that are existing in the world, and this is where the Piketty work becomes very important, means that there's reasons that there are the fights that there are, and how does that get exposed, and what's our work to expose what really is preventing people and nations from having the better health that they could have.
Hi, I have a question about, I think, a common thread throughout the day, which has been inequality. It kind of came out from Professor Chandra's point about sort of a policy space that's oriented towards a particular segment of the society. And I think that the problem is inequality and the solution is often poverty reduction. But that's only a particular solution to a broader problem. And I think here explicitly about the inequalities dimension of the post-2015 development agenda and the fact that David Cameron was very instrumental in shifting it from inequalities to poverty reduction. And that leaves an entire segment out. And I think the example from India is very much about what the consequences are of societies that are increasingly oriented towards delivery to the high-end segment, what the consequences are for everyone else. So how to shift the agenda, to be broader than poverty reduction, which also, again, gets to the point about services for poor people or poor services, and towards, actually addressing the inequality issue, which means the people at the top as well as the people at the bottom. And sorry to go on long, but just to add that if you add in finite natural resources to this, you add in the environmental dimension, then it becomes all the more important to address high consumption, high production at the top. Thank you.
Maybe we'll give our panelists an opportunity to respond to some of the points that we made.
I can. So sort of one point, just building on some of these thoughts, and especially Nancy, your point about this, social political narrative. I think Sen, Amartya Sen had recently had this book, An Uncertain Glory, which was kind of a revisiting the India story after about 20 years. His first book was, I think, around 1995. And I think the key part there was really about this narrative. I think you see it's not like the narrative in India is about the top 1%. I think there's a very subtle shift towards those 100 million Indians, and it's the pro-middle class, whatever we want to call them. And that's pervaded through almost every sphere of the policy making, to the journalistic world, to the media. And I think that's where some of the comments, the universality becomes a really issue, because then these narratives will then reiterate to shape those policies. Because there is a view that when I talk to people, you say India, the image that you these days get is not the slums that much, probably you do, but it's the airports or look at the investment that's happening there. It's in broadband. Even US is not talking about broadband investment. But if you go to any of these areas, you could still see the slum situation has hardly changed. Right, so I think there is a sort of the combining some of that, how do you bring in, I think he provides this framework of how do you, I think it's partly the media then comes in a big way, which has really pervaded now who's the more dominant class and who's going to drive the narrative. But that's just sort of one thought which I thought sort of was a good insight into, it's not just there are not policies, but there's these subtle shifts, and it's not really about the rich. It's really about someone who's just doing enough to be involved in the global economy and polity. And relatedly, another work that we've been doing with Dr. Mariana Arcaya, we've been thinking whether countries are actually, you said, Julio, the developing countries is a meaningless term. I think countries are becoming increasingly meaningless because it's really populations. Like, you look into any specific country, we are trying to do some fancy statistical modeling around this to actually show that it's not that we are 180 countries, but probably there are 50 populations around the world. And for each population, there might be commonalities across that for some of them. And maybe that's the way to think about the proportionate universalism. It's across populations, not so much by countries, because the country is increasingly not terribly, given the globalization and the forces. So that's just another thought to sort of shifting the thing to actual populations. And I think that's becoming, I think that will be more palatable as countries become more connected in some ways, not from the sovereign perspective, but from an organizational or how we think about it.
So let me take a stab at what was just said. I think we want to do two things. We all agree we would like to fight poverty, but and there are two ways to fight poverty. One, at a very simplistic level, one could redistribute more, or one could just rely on economic growth to kind of pull people out of poverty. In India and China, we've seen lots of evidence that we can do that. My view is that's insufficient, because what we really care about is not just having low rates of poverty, but having people live to their capacities and their capabilities, and that doesn't go hand in hand with the reduction in poverty. Your work shows again and again that districts in India that grew the most in terms of actual real reductions in poverty were not the districts where we saw improvements in the form of less stunting and more nourished kids. So you can see this lack of association between improvements on the poverty front and improvements in health. Now, what's optimistic is when we take on health directly, we can improve health directly. It often tends not to be through health insurance. It tends to be what happened in India 5 years ago. India had half the world's cases of polio. That was 5 years ago. And then last month, the WHO said India is polio-free. It was a great triumph of public health. So, we did that at a time when India didn't grow economically at all. So there's this complete disconnect between, economic growth and health. And I guess the health economist in me cares much more about health than economic growth. So I think that what I think about a lot is, how do we get to poor people in India and Bangladesh the kinds of interventions that we were consuming in the United States in the 1920s and the 1930s, which doesn't really take economic growth. It just takes a completely different kind of delivery system to deliver. These challenges are really, really hard. And that brings me to Nancy's point about new institutions. We're very good here. You can see this in the context of the ACA and the rollout of the ACA in thinking about how do we do this squiggle and that twiddle and that website to get things working. But what we never managed to do, and this is a criticism on both sides of the aisle, to think, well, what is the institution that we would have needed to create that would have avoided this problem in the first place? And so, think about, again, this linkage between economic inequality, growing economic inequality, and what it does to the demand for healthcare. In the United States, let's just take US data. The average American household earns $50,000 a year. And a household at the 99th percentile earns $400,000 a year. So there's an eightfold difference in income. There's probably going to be more than an eightfold difference in terms of how much they want to spend on healthcare. So let's just say that all households, just to simplify, want to spend 10% of their budget on healthcare. One household wants to spend $5,000 a year. The other household wants to spend $40,000 a year. Now, the delivery system of today is being asked to serve both kinds of households. But these are very different households. The household that earns $50,000 will become the household that earns $400,000 at an economic growth rate of 2%. So that takes about 75 years of economic growth at 2% for that $50,000 household to become the $400,000 household. So we essentially live in a world, 72 years ago, Harry Truman was president, we had just started the Korean War, there were no treatments for heart attacks, hospitals were dangerous places, infant mortality was, 5 times what it is today. Imagine going back to the Truman administration and saying, we want to cover stage 4 pancreatic cancer, we want to cover robotic surgery for radical prostatectomy, we want to cover stenting for stable coronary disease. What would they have done? And that is the challenge that India grapples with every day. There's these two Indias, and the magnitude of the income disparity puts tremendous pressure on central government. But the money, the voice is all in the rich. And so you have to think about, as Nancy put it, not the technocratic solution, but what is the institution that that country needs to deal with this challenge? We never figured it out, but hopefully they will figure it out.
Hopefully.
I just wanted to pick up on one aspect of, I think, mostly Nancy's question about growing inequality. I think in the United States and in many different arenas, we're seeing the privatization of risk. And people with means are able to insure themselves against many aspects of risk. And those and you don't even have to go to the poor, but just half of the population under that 50,000 mark really can't protect themselves from all kinds of risk, from foreclosure, from illness, from disasters, from all kinds of different things that those who are at the top are better able to protect themselves from. And that kind of inequality is reflected in the institutions that we build. And so I think it is a very important question to ask. And in the specific work that I'm doing on Katrina, there's also the element of race and the real distance that many Americans feel from the people who they saw suffering on television and then immediately forgot about. And so I think part of our job as scholars is to try to find all of these inconvenient facts and to make them very well known to people, but also to think creatively about these very, very difficult dilemmas, which are not easily addressed in a institutional way, but often people are finding these individualistic solutions which leave those without the safety net really even much worse off.
And I think Sir Michael had a question.
Just to comment on a couple of things that have been said, if I could remember, I think I wanted to make 3 comments. The first, Julio's comment about progressive universalism. Had I known the term was around, I might have used that rather than proportionate, but I used it. But I'm careful about saying we just want to be pro-poor, and it's just fortunate that being pro-poor, equity and efficiency come together. They don't always. And that's an issue, because when you said, well, we just want to do the things that are most cost effective, if we look in rich countries, take cancer survival. We know cancer survival is better in higher status people than it is in lower status people. And I had a conversation with Minister of Health in Ireland, the same one who's now invited me to go back. So obviously I didn't offend her too much, because she said, I want to spend the money where it'll do the most good. And I said, spend it on the middle classes. And she was shocked. I said, well, you want to spend the money where it'll do the most good. That's where it'll do the most. Forget the poor. I said, it's a waste spending money on the poor. You get much less improvement for a given expenditure spending it on poor people, if it's cancer survival or treatment post-myocardial infarction, or even education. Don't spend money on children from deprived backgrounds. Give your computer skills and everything to the kids from advantaged backgrounds. She said, but that's not what I came into politics to do. I want to help the worst off. Aha. I said, I would vote for you. You have an equity principle, not just an efficiency principle. And in this case, there's a trade-off. You were giving examples where perhaps there's not a trade-off, and they're good examples where there aren't trade-offs. But where there is a trade-off, then you've got to decide which is more important, the equity principle or the efficiency principle. Now, if something is ineffective, that can hardly be in favour of an equity principle. It can't be good to waste money, not spend money where it'll do any good. But we do have that trade-off. The second point is about being pro-poor. As Julio, you know, and I'm sure everybody else knows, increasingly we're worried about the gap in living conditions between the middle income and the 1%. Not just the poor and the middle. The big increases have been between the middle and the top. And the implication of that, and the social gradient in health, is that we don't want to just be pro-poor. We want to do something about this ridiculous pool of wealth and income right at the very top that's not going on. So we can't invest in better schools because we don't have the money, because it's a low tax base. We can't invest in preschool education because we don't have the money. In my country, we're saying, how could we possibly afford the health service that we need over the next 10 years? What? We're lowering tax rates for the rich, and we're then saying we can't afford a health service. Now, we don't have the problem of, should we have different health care for the people on 50,000 or 400,000? We have a very quaint system. You get the same care, whatever your income, regardless of ability to pay. It's based on need, not on ability to pay. I know that's quaint, but many European countries do follow that quaint idea, and I realize that's anathema, but I can't solve your problems. But we don't have that idea that there should be a different health service for people on 50,000 or 400. We think there should be the same health service. So it's not like Mercedes cars. If you're rich, you can have a Mercedes car, and if you're not rich, you can't have a Mercedes car, and that's the way it is. But if you're poor and you've got chronic renal disease, you should have access to dialysis and renal transplantation, the same as if you're rich. It shouldn't have anything to do with the ability to pay. And the third comment relates to, and I think it relates to Nancy's point, about where's the lever for change? Now, again, I can't deal with your problems, but take Sweden. I've made several trips to government ministers in Sweden. Most recently, I went to the Swedish Parliament. And at a national level in Sweden, they've been reluctant. They've got a centre-right coalition. They've been reluctant to take national action on social determinants of health and health equity. But the last time I went to the Parliament, I said to them, they're doing it in Malmö. They're doing it in Gothenburg. They're doing it in Linköping. They're considering it in the north. Before you know where you are, every local area in Sweden will have action plans on social determinants of health equity, and you'll be running to catch up. You'll be doing what national leaders commonly do. They wait till 95% of the population are all marching in one direction, then they run round the front of the march and pretend they were leading it. And that's what you'll be doing. Now, I think, both in your country and in mine, we've got a major challenge of empowering the population, of using our role as experts to help inform the debate, not to lead the debate, but to help inform the debate and empower populations. And as I go around to some of these areas in England that are implementing my review, it is inspiring what local people understand about the problems that they have and that's not getting through to the politicians. And I think that's a major challenge of how we actually change the political debate so it more reflects what people going about their daily lives understand.
Well, I don't have a speech. I have actually a question for the panel, which it's sort of an underlying tension about how we think about the criteria for measuring success in the years ahead of what we do in the centre and in the wider area on health and health inequities. Because we've got from the UNFPA and other sources suggestions that we should be stressing the rights-based approach. And if we look at the kind of intellectual background to some of that from SAN and the capability approach, it's very individualistic and very focused on the individual's right to choose and from a particular set of opportunities to realize a set of capabilities and to achieve certain functionings. Whereas all of the success stories we've heard about whether it's the Mohammed report or the description of what goes on in terms of the determinants of inequalities, Nancy's talk about the need to address political structures and so on, it's very much at an aggregate and at a social and a collection. It's a population-based level of approach. And I think many of us are struggling between these individual level type scorings and something which is more to do with like measuring how social integration and social development is going longer term. And I'd like to know whether the panel share some of these agonies and whether they've actually thought about, is there a way in which we can say to the international agencies, let's go for this set of criteria because they're more likely to achieve the outcomes we would like to achieve, rather than get off on the wrong track and saying that everybody should have, by right, the chance to have a heart transplant if they have any heart disease. Thank you.
Would the panel like to address this easy question?
I think a simple sort of a quick reaction to that would be, I think, again, a work that I think Lisa pointed out, which is like, the notion of monitoring and surveillance have purely relied on averages, right? So that's your collective in some sense. But when it comes, there is a distribution aspect to that whole thing, which you're partly reflecting to. And if other indicators are showing what we showed for BMI, there's an increased dispersion. And if that's following some sort of a broader dispersion in income or whatever it is, then maybe all the metrics needs to have both the parameters together, so because the one average is probably becoming less meaningful, and to that extent, maybe that's just one quick answer, that you could have two columns instead of one, both the average, HDI, whatever it is, and then the dispersion.
I would just say yes, I share your agony.
So, when again, the only thing I know something about is healthcare. On healthcare, I think that there is a lot of different people, different families have different preferences for healthcare. And going back to Michael's point about buying presents for one's grandchildren, I think we shouldn't be straitjacketing everybody into the same healthcare system. I think we should give them access to the same system. But if someone wants a less generous system, a system that offers leaner care, doesn't cover a whole bunch of things that are unproven or extremely expensive, that person should get money back that they can use to buy presents for their grandson.
Thank you very much. And I think you're keen to make a comment. So this is the last comment. Please.
I think the point that you make about human rights, individual based, but it seems to me that if we get it right and we're able to reach everybody, it actually aggregates at the macro level to the kind of things we like to see. What we see all the time is that on the average, we measure progress, but we actually leave out large tracts of people who don't have access to anything. And I think that we need to begin to think about that, the equity, the social justice, the right approach, and all of that. But let me pose one thing. David, I'm going to take 1 minute. Let me pose one thing. And I've listened and I've learned. Now, the health systems we keep talking about is based on a model of Western Europe and North America. Is that the best for the world? Shall we not be looking at, especially for the developing world, a different health system that provides a different kind of care, which is not driven from a clinical perspective, but which is driven from the individual taking charge of his or her own health. Shall we not, as we go forward, talk to people about smoking, alcohol, sugar consumption, fat consumption, exercise? Make sure that actually it's more holistic, because when it gets to it, and developing countries are going to overcome the big disease burden of communicable diseases, they are not going to be able to afford the kind of things we're talking about. And I think that might change, actually, our view of health and the way we govern it. Thank you.
And I'd just like to finish by thanking all our panelists for, I think, for an excellent discussion that we had here. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank David and the panel also, and all of you for coming here today. And our three speakers were fantastic, and I thank Julio for making those opening comments that fit in perfectly well with the agenda. And I think you can all see there's lots of work for the next 50 years. So I thank you a lot for coming and look forward to working with you in the future.